In this final lesson in the series on memory, we'll see what happens when we retrieve a memory, and then we'll have some final words about what is a memory. So after one learning event, we have a brain that looks like this. We've got strong hippocampal memory trace, but we've got weak cortical memory traces. And so we said the hippocampal memory trace is like an index. It is going to be needed to locate and to reactivate the cortical memory traces if we want to retrieve this information. So what is retrieval? Well, usually retrieval is triggered by a cue, a retrieval cue, and that's a stimulus that is part of the original learning event. So remember, the classroom learning event is you were on the microscope seeing amoeba and paramecia, and you're hearing things about amoeba and paramecia. So in this case, then, the retrieval cue is going to come in through the auditory channel. Suppose the teacher says amoeba. Well, the same neurons that were activated in the original learning event will be activated by the cue, but notice, since it's an auditory cue, only the auditory neurons are activated. The visual neurons are not activated, neither the somatosensory neurons up here. Now, what will happen when these auditory neurons are activated? They're going to send information down into the hippocampus and reactivate the very same hippocampal neuron that was allocated during the original learning event. So we've got activity in the green neuron in the hippocampal memory trace. But now something cool happens. As a result of synaptic plasticity between those allocated hippocampal neurons, the green neuron is going to be able to activate the entire set of neurons in the hippocampal memory trace. Scientists call this pattern completion. And now what the brain is going to do then is it's going to use the activation of the hippocampal memory trace to locate and activate the cortical memory traces. And we'll just sort of give that a name, memory reconstruction. So here we see the hippocampal neurons sending signals up into the cortex to reactivate those allocated neurons. And so we're reestablishing a similar pattern of cortical activity as existed during the original learning event. Notice the flow of information is in the opposite direction. During learning, the flow was from cortex to hippocampus. During retrieval, is from hippocampus out to cortex. And when the cortical neurons are reactivated, they will send information up into the working memory system, and we will experience the conscious retrieval of the memory. If it has lots of details, that would be an episodic memory. Now again, for a period of time after our initial learning event, the hippocampal index is going to be required to reactivate these cortical memory traces, and that's because they are weak at this early stage in the learning process. Fortunately for us, the brain realizes Now let's recall that for a period of time after our first learning event, the hippocampal index is going to be required to retrieve, to activate these cortical Now let's emphasize again that for a period of time after our first learning event, the hippocampal index is going to be required to reactivate these cortical memory traces because they are weak at this early stage in the learning process. But a surprising thing happens when we go to sleep. During sleep, the brain reprocesses recently learned information. The hippocampal memory traces are reactivated, and signals are sent to the cortex to strengthen the cortical memory traces. And we're going to call this process system consolidation. This is the reorganization of memory across multiple brain areas. So the memory for the learned event becomes reorganized and less dependent upon the hippocampal memory trace. You see, if you strengthen these cortical memory traces, then the brain has other retrieval systems that can activate these cortical memory traces without the need of the hippocampal index. So the effect of the system consolidation then is we start with strong hippocampal memory trace, weak cortical memory trace, and as a result of this reprocessing during sleep, we are strengthening the cortical memory traces. Again, we're calling this system consolidation. Metaphorically, it's sort of like the hippocampus is teaching the cortex to strengthen those cortical memory traces that were associated with a learning event. Now, the result of system consolidation is a network of strong cortical memory traces. And during this process, the brain will be able to link these distributed cortical memory traces so we can build up the concept of the thing that we learned about. In this case, it would be the concept of an amoeba and other facts about amoeba. So notice then what we're linking together in our semantic memory is what an amoeba looks like. That's stored in visual areas. What the microscope feels like, that's stored in the somatosensory areas. What the sound of the word amoeba sounds like, and that's stored in the auditory areas. And then we can link them together so that if I see an amoeba, I can reactivate the word amoeba. If I hear the word amoeba, I can activate in my mind's eye, my visual imagination, what an amoeba looks like, or I could draw it. So that's the idea then of building semantic memory. And again, the hippocampus was necessary to do this because the hippocampus is a key player in system consolidation. Notice then that once we have established strong cortical memory traces, we no longer need the hippocampal index to locate those memory traces. Other frontal cortex memory retrieval systems can reactivate these cortical memory traces with ease because they have been strengthened by system consolidation. Now, there are good reasons to do system consolidation because changes are occurring in the hippocampus that will wipe away memory traces. Hippocampal memory traces are vulnerable to interference from new learning, the disruption of new neurons, and the refreshing effects of sleep. And we'll say more about this in future lessons, but the idea for the interference from new learning is that there's limited storage space. There's only a finite number of synapses in the hippocampus. And so you may be sort of, as you learn new things, interfering with older memory traces in the hippocampus. In addition, there's evidence from animals that the hippocampus is one of the few areas in the brain where new neurons are produced. And as they take up positions in the hippocampus and make new synaptic connections, that may be disrupting older memory traces. And finally, sleep. While we just said that sleep helps the brain sort of strengthen the cortical memory traces, it turns out that scientists are gathering evidence that in addition, the hippocampal synapses are weakened. That sounds counterintuitive, but the idea is to weaken the hippocampal synapses during sleep so that they can be strengthened again for new learning the next day. So sleep is in a sense critically involved in storing information in the long-term system and helping to prepare the hippocampus for new learning. Well, all of that then makes sense then of why we undergo system consolidation. We need to consolidate recently learned information so that we can be prepared to learn new things. We'll end this lesson series then with the question, what is a memory? Take a look at the brain here. Let's say we've got some cortical neurons shown here, some in brown, but some in white. And here's a magnification. And the idea is when we are in a learning situation, our cortex is going to be processing that information, encoding the information. And let's say the white neurons are the ones that were activated during the encoding process. Well, a subset of those neurons will be allocated to forming the memory trace for that event. At the level of neurons, we have an allocation of synapses as well. Only certain synapses will be strengthened. We called this plasticity, and we learned about the rule that neurons that fire together wire together. Only those inputs that were currently active at the time the target cell fires, only those synapses will be strengthened. The result then is that we're forming memory traces. Allocated neurons have strengthened their connections. Yes, to be sure, early on is the hippocampal memory trace that is stronger than the cortical memory traces, but over time, and after some good sleep, we can begin to strengthen these cortical memory traces. So there is this network of allocated neurons that have enjoyed synaptic plasticity, and they're all linked together. They represent a pattern of brain activity that occurred during the initial learning event. System consolidation then will help us strengthen these cortical memory traces so that retrieval doesn't require the hippocampus any longer. But what is a memory then? A memory is a pattern of strengthened synapses distributed across allocated neurons. And to successfully retrieve a memory then, what we've got to do is to reactivate those allocated neurons, the same neurons that were activated during the initial learning event. So we're trying to recreate a pattern of brain activity that occurred during the learning event. And if we're successful, we will load up that information into our working memory and enjoy a conscious experience of memory retrieval.